Prehistoric Australia was far more dangerous than they told us. Documentary for sleep. Tonight, we're traveling to a version of Australia that feels both ancient and strangely familiar, an island continent drifting through deep time, growing wilder in its isolation. And while the world slept, Australia experimented, building creatures that were bigger, tougher, and sometimes far more dangerous than the neat museum labels suggest. So settle in, let your shoulders soften, because in this documentary for sleep, we'll walk through moonlit forests and sun-baked plains, listening for the quiet evidence of giants, footprints in hardened mud, bite marks in bone, and the faint, lingering question of what once watched from the shadows. Long before anyone could have called it Australia, this land was part of something vast and connected, an ancient southern world stitched together like a single slow-moving tapestry. Forests stretched across places that are now oceans, rivers braided through valleys that no longer exist, and the first rule of life back then was simple: nothing stays the same for long. Over deep time, the planet rearranged itself with a patience that feels almost unimaginable. Continents drifted the way clouds drift, quietly, steadily, without drama in the moment, but with enormous consequences in the long run. And one day, the great landmass that would become Australia began to separate from its neighbours, not with a sudden tear, but with a gradual widening, an opening that became a sea, and then an ocean. The distances grew, the bridges disappeared, and in that growing isolation, the entire story of life here began to change. Because isolation is not emptiness, isolation is a laboratory. When a place is cut off from the rest of the world, nature doesn't pause. It adapts, it experiments, it fills gaps, it invents. New combinations of traits become possible simply because the usual competitors never arrive, and the usual predators never cross the water. Some lineages that might have been pushed aside elsewhere get to flourish. Others turn strange. Others grow large. Others become specialists, tuned to their corner of the world like instruments tuned to one particular song. So as Australia drifted northward, it carried its living cargo into a different future. It wasn't just geography that changed. The climate shifted too. The patterns of rainfall, the pulse of seasons, the balance between forest and open land, these things moved and transformed as the continent changed latitude and the world around it cooled and warmed in cycles. If you picture the land itself breathing over millions of years, you begin to sense the rhythm: wetter periods, drier periods, lakes swelling and shrinking, rivers cutting new paths, plants spreading, retreating, changing their shape and strategy as the air and soil changed with them. There were times when woodlands were broader and more continuous, and times when open spaces expanded, and times when the edges between habitats became the most important places of all, where life could hide, hunt, and move between worlds. And within that changing landscape, the creatures of Australia began to take on forms that feel, even now, a little dreamlike. Marsupials, animals that carry their young in pouches, did not exist only here, but they became the true architects of this ecosystem. In many other parts of the world, placental mammals filled most of the major roles: large grazers, big predators, swift runners. But in Australia, cut off and independent, marsupials diversified into many shapes at once. Some became small and quick, living in burrows and crevices. Some climbed, some grazed, some hunted, And because evolution works with what it has, it built these animals from a different toolkit than the one used elsewhere. Even the birds became different. Some took to the air and became travelers, crossing great distances. Others grew heavier and more grounded, shaped by a land where running and standing could be just as important as flying. Reptiles, already ancient and well adapted to heat and waiting, found space to thrive too, sometimes as silent hunters, sometimes as armored survivors, sometimes as living echoes of an older Earth. And then, slowly, as if the continent had been preparing itself, the size of life began to change. It's tempting to imagine prehistoric Australia as a single unbroken desert, the way it looks on some modern maps. But for much of its story, the land was more varied than that. There were forests and woodlands, grasslands and scrub, wetlands and river systems. There were pockets of abundance, places where water gathered, where plants grew thick, where animals could feed and linger. These pockets mattered because they created meeting points. Herds would move toward them, predators would know the routes, scavengers would follow the leftovers. In ecology, the most important places are often the ones where paths cross. And when animals meet again and again in the same places, certain traits become valuable. Being large can help you reach higher leaves. Being large can help you travel farther between water sources. Being large can help you endure lean seasons. Being large can help you defend yourself, or at least make you costly to attack. So the continent began to host animals that were not just bigger than what we know today, but bigger in a way that shifts the atmosphere of the entire landscape. You can feel it in your mind like a change in pressure. The ground seems heavier. The trees seem lower by comparison. Even the silence seems different, because the quiet of a place with giants is not the same as the quiet of a place without them. In that ancient Australia, the horizon would not have been empty. It would have been populated by moving shapes, slow, steady, purposeful. The kind of movement that doesn't hurry because it doesn't need to. And if you listen closely, you can almost imagine the soundscape. Not loud, not constant, just occasional signals. The scrape of a large foot against dry ground. The slow exhale of a massive animal at rest. The soft crack of branches under a heavy body. The distant calls of birds carrying over open land. The wind moving through grasses and leaving behind a hush that feels like a held breath. This is where the story begins to lean toward danger. Not the dramatic danger of a chase, but the quiet danger of a system that includes powerful bodies and hungry mouths. Because where there are giants, there are also the forces that shape giants. Competition, scarcity, and predation. And so, when we step forward into the later chapters of prehistory, we find ourselves in a world that is not merely strange, but intense. A world where the animals are large enough to reshape the land as they move through it. A world where each pathway to water is a story. A world where the shadow of a tree can be a hiding place for something patient. Now imagine the open plains again, but closer. So close, you can see the texture of the earth. Here, in the Pleistocene, you could walk across ground that has been pressed and hardened by countless journeys. There are tracks everywhere, some fresh, some older, some partially softened by time. The landscape is a map of movement, and every track tells you who passed through and in which direction. In this era, Australia's megafauna were not just occasional oddities. They were major characters. They were the bulk and muscle of entire ecosystems. Their bodies were engines, turning plant matter into motion, into heat, into life. They shaped the vegetation by feeding and trampling. They spread seeds by carrying them in their guts and dropping them far from where they were eaten. They opened pathways through dense scrub. They created clearings. They widened trails. And in subtle ways, they influenced where water pooled and how soil was disturbed. One of the most famous of these giants is Diprotodon, often described as a wombat relative, though imagining it as merely an oversized wombat doesn't quite capture the feeling. Diprotodon was massive, with a body built for steady travel and heavy feeding. If you picture it moving, it's not leaping or darting. It's trudging. It's calm, deliberate. The kind of animal that can walk into a patch of vegetation and simply take what it wants. And around such animals, there's always a sense of weight. Not just the weight of their bodies, but the weight of their presence on the land. Where they gather, the ground becomes worn. The plants change, the insects change, birds gather, and the smaller animals learn to pay attention, because when a giant moves, it changes what is possible. Then there were the enormous kangaroos of the past, some built very differently from the ones we see today. When we imagine kangaroos, we often imagine speed, bounding, quick turns. But some prehistoric kangaroos appear to have been heavier, more upright, more specialized for strength and reach than for pure athletic sprinting. Their size alone would have made them imposing. You wouldn't see a creature like that and think of it as fragile. You'd think of it as something that could hold its ground. And beyond kangaroos and wombat relatives, there were other strange giants, massive marsupial herbivores with skulls and jaws shaped for tough plants, broad-bodied browsers moving between woodland edges and open country, and creatures that today have no direct equivalents in Australia at all. But the most important truth about an ecosystem filled with large plant eaters is that it never stays gentle for long, because large animals are food. Not easy food, often very difficult food, but still food. And in nature, difficulty doesn't prevent hunting. It simply selects for hunters that are patient, strong, clever, or opportunistic enough to overcome the challenge. So as herds moved across the plains, toward water, toward greener patches, toward seasonal abundance, predators followed the same routes, not at the same speed, but with the same knowledge. They didn't need to chase all day. They only needed to know where life would pass. Imagine a watering place at dusk. The light softens, the temperature drops, and the air becomes still. The surface of the water reflects the sky almost perfectly. Birds settle. Insects shift their sound. And then the first large herbivore approaches. It doesn't rush. It pauses. It listens. It scans. Because even in a world where giants dominate, danger can still arrive. The animal steps forward, drinks, lifts its head, and watches. Another joins, then another. Soon there is a cluster of heavy bodies, each one breathing slowly, each one aware that the same water they need is also the most predictable place to be found. This is where the feeling of prehistoric Australia becomes truly vivid. Not because something terrible is happening, but because something could. And that could is the real tension of the natural world. In a land of megafauna, the predators didn't need to be everywhere. They didn't need to show themselves. The mere possibility shaped behavior. Herds would likely be watchful at edges, careful in unfamiliar patches, attentive to wind direction. Smaller animals would time their movements around the giants, using them as cover, following them for safety, or avoiding them because giants can be unpredictable and dangerous in their own right. Even plant eaters can be dangerous when they are huge. A frightened giant doesn't need to bite to harm you, it only needs to panic. A stampede doesn't require aggression, only urgency. A kick, a shove, a sudden charge. These things are part of the physics of large bodies sharing space. So danger in this world came in layers. There was the danger of predators, the danger of competition, the danger of scarcity, the danger of climate and heat, the danger of getting stuck in mud near a shrinking lake, the danger of a dry season that lasts too long. And through all of it, the megafauna continued their slow, purposeful lives, eating, moving, resting, traveling again. It's comforting, in a strange way, to imagine these giants at rest. To picture a group of massive herbivores lying in the shade, their breathing slow, their eyes half-lidded, the heat of the day pressing down around them. It makes the past feel less like a monster story and more like a real place. One with calm moments, long afternoons, and the steady work of simply staying alive. But the calm in nature is never the end of the story. It's a pause between movements. As the light changes, as shadows lengthen, as temperatures drop, the balance shifts. The hunters become more active. The grazers become more alert. The world transitions into a different mode, and the same landscape that seemed open and clear in daylight becomes complex at twilight, full of concealment, full of edges and blind spots, full of places where something could be watching. And if you're letting yourself drift now, if your thoughts are slowing and your body is sinking deeper into comfort, then you're feeling something true about this ancient world. Because the past, like sleep, is not a single moment. It's a long, slow transition, a drifting continent, a changing climate, a land learning its own rules, and an ecosystem where giants moved quietly through time, carrying danger with them not as a constant threat, but as a possibility hidden in the stillness. In a world of giants, danger doesn't always announce itself from far away. Sometimes, the most powerful hunters are the ones you don't notice until the moment is already happening, until the calm air breaks, until birds lift suddenly into the sky, until a herd tightens into a single tense shape. And in prehistoric Australia, some of the most unsettling danger likely lived in places where light and shadow mixed together, along woodland edges, beneath thick canopies, and in the quiet corridors where animals moved between open plains and forest cover. If you imagine yourself walking through that ancient landscape, you can begin to feel why ambush would have been such a successful strategy. Australia had wide spaces, yes, but it also had plenty of broken ground, pockets of trees, scrubby thickets, and uneven terrain. In those environments, running fast in a straight line is not always the best way to survive. What matters is being able to wait, to hide, to strike close, to use the land as part of your body. And this is where the famous marsupial predator enters the story, not as a myth, but as a creature shaped by the demands of its world. Thylacoleo, the so-called marsupial lion, is one of those animals that makes people pause because it feels both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Familiar because we recognize the role it played, a large carnivore capable of killing substantial prey. Unfamiliar because it didn't come from the same lineage as Africa's lions or America's big cats. It wasn't built from the cat blueprint, it was built from a marsupial blueprint, An entirely different architectural plan, modified and sharpened until it could do the work of a top predator. When you picture it, it helps to release the modern idea of a lion entirely. Think instead of an animal designed for close contact. A predator meant to grab, hold, pull down, and overpower. Not necessarily a long-distance runner across open grass, but a specialist in ambush. An expert in the sudden, violent moment when distance collapses. Its body suggests strength. Its forelimbs, in particular, are often described as powerful, built not for gentle climbing, but for gripping and controlling. A hunter like that doesn't need to be faster than everything it hunts. It needs to be close enough before it's detected. It needs to choose the right time. It needs to turn surprise into advantage before the prey can fully understand what is happening. Now imagine the prey in that world. It wasn't small and delicate. It could be massive. It could be thick-skinned or heavily muscled. Some animals might have been tall enough to browse at higher leaves, others heavy enough to make the ground tremble. So the predator's job wasn't only to kill, it was to choose wisely, to target individuals that were vulnerable, young, old, sick, separated, distracted. That's what a patient hunter does. It doesn't fight every battle. It fights the ones it can win. And the place where those opportunities appear most often is at the edges, the boundary zones, the line between woodland and open ground, the corridor leading down to water, the narrow passage between thick brush and rocky outcrop, the shaded path where a herd moves single file because it's the easiest route. Edges are where visibility is worst and movement is constrained. Edges are where light changes rapidly, confusing the eyes. Edges are where wind shifts around trees and hills, carrying scent in unpredictable patterns. And for an ambush predator, edges are perfect. You can almost see it. A herd moving toward a waterhole at dusk, not quite relaxed, but eager for the drink. They step slowly, pausing, listening. The air is cooler now, carrying more scent. Insects hum. A bird calls once, then stops. And somewhere in the shade, something is waiting, not moving, not breathing loudly, letting the world come to it. This is what makes ambush hunting feel so eerie when we imagine it. It's not the chase, it's the waiting. The idea that danger can be present without motion. And the waiting would have been easier in a landscape where time itself moved differently. When you're a predator that relies on ambush, you don't need constant activity. You need bursts. You need patience that lasts hours. You need the ability to stay still even when your muscles want to move. The natural world rewards that kind of discipline. But Thylacoleo wasn't alone in shaping that feeling of danger. There were other predators too, some smaller, some less famous, all part of a layered system. In any ecosystem, the top predator is only one piece of a larger puzzle. Beneath it are mid-level predators, hunters of smaller prey, opportunists, scavengers that sometimes kill if they can. There are animals that target eggs and young, animals that steal meals, animals that follow the big hunters at a distance, waiting for scraps or a moment of weakness. Even the birds would have played roles that feel sharper than we often imagine. Birds are not just background music in nature. They are eyes. They are alarms. They are scavengers. They are thieves. They are sometimes hunters. In ancient Australia, large birds existed that could have been intimidating simply because of their presence. Tall bodies, heavy steps, strong legs built for walking across land with confidence. Not every large bird is a predator, but size changes behavior. A large animal can stand closer, push harder, claim space, and force smaller creatures to move aside. And then there are the birds that watch and signal. In modern environments, birds often react first to a predator. They call, they scatter, they become a kind of nervous system for the landscape. If something large moves through the brush, birds notice. If something climbs a tree, birds notice. If something is waiting too long in one place, birds notice. So an ambush predator has to solve a problem. Not just, how do I get close to prey, but how do I get close without the entire landscape announcing me? That means using cover not only from prey, but from the watchers above. It means approaching slowly, choosing paths that minimize noise, moving when the wind is right, waiting for the moment when birds are distracted, or when the sounds of the environment, wind, insects, other animals, mask the small noises of your body. If you let your mind sink into the texture of that world, you begin to feel how layered it was. Movement inside movement, attention inside attention, predators watching prey, prey watching predators, birds watching everything, and all of it happening in an atmosphere that changes with light, because light is one of the most powerful forces in hunting. At midday, the sun can flatten the landscape, exposing movement and reducing concealment. But at dawn and dusk, the world becomes complex. Shadows stretch, colors soften, the eye struggles to define shape at a distance. Motion becomes harder to track. And that is when the ambush hunter becomes most effective. There's a reason so many animals in modern ecosystems are most active in the twilight hours. It's not just temperature, it's visibility. Twilight is a compromise between darkness and daylight, a time when the world is neither fully seen nor fully hidden. In prehistoric Australia, that twilight would have belonged to the ambush hunters. And if Thylacoleo used trees, and many researchers have suggested it, may have been capable of climbing, then the danger takes on an even more unsettling dimension. A predator above you changes everything. It turns your relationship with the landscape upside down. You can watch the horizon, scan the grass, look for movement at ground level, and still miss the silent weight above. Imagine moving beneath a canopy where branches interlace overhead. You can hear leaves shifting. You can smell sap and damp wood. The ground is scattered with fallen bark and dry litter. Your steps are softer here, but so are the steps of anything else. And the shadows up in the branches can hide the outline of a body pressed close to wood. An animal waiting above doesn't need to chase. It needs only to drop with the right timing, to land with force, to clamp and hold, turning gravity into a weapon. This is the kind of danger that doesn't feel like a cinematic sprint. It feels like a trapdoor. And it's possible that many of the big herbivores of the time would have had behaviors shaped by that possibility, staying closer together in certain areas, avoiding thick cover at certain hours, moving more quickly through narrow corridors, choosing open approaches to water when available, pausing often to scan not just the ground, but the trees. Even today, prey animals in predator-rich environments develop these patterns. They don't need to know the predator in the way we think of knowledge. They only need to survive the ones that don't pay attention. Over generations, attentiveness becomes a trait. Caution becomes instinct. And that instinct is written into bodies. The way eyes are positioned, the way ears swivel, the way an animal freezes when something changes. In a sense, predators shape the minds of their prey. They sculpt behavior. They define what normal feels like. A peaceful landscape to us might have felt tense and alert to the animals living there, because tension was a survival tool. And then, beyond direct predation, there is the quiet danger of scavenging and competition, because a kill attracts attention. If a large predator brought down a big herbivore, the event would ripple outward through the ecosystem like a signal. Smell carries far. Birds circle. Smaller predators arrive. Insects gather. The landscape shifts around the kill site, and for a time, it becomes a place of risk, where even hunters can become hunted, where fights can break out, where injuries are common. That means an ambush predator isn't just fighting prey, it is also racing time. The longer it takes to secure a kill and feed, the more likely it is that others will arrive. So efficiency matters, strength matters, the ability to drag prey into cover matters. If Thylacoleo could pull a carcass into trees or dense brush, or even simply reposition it into a safer place, then that ability would have been a powerful advantage in a competitive ecosystem. It would allow feeding without constant conflict. It would allow the predator to claim the meal with less risk. And when you imagine that, an animal strong enough to shift the location of a kill, you begin to feel the true scale of its power, not just in the moment of attack, but in what comes after. The control of resources. Now, if your mind is drifting, let it drift with this picture. A quiet woodland at twilight, the air cooling, the first stars beginning to appear faintly above the canopy. Somewhere in the distance, large herbivores move like slow shadows, their footfalls dull and heavy. A few birds call, then settle. Insects continue their soft chorus. The wind moves gently through leaves, and hidden within all of that is an animal built for stillness, not restless, not noisy, not eager to reveal itself, just waiting for the landscape to deliver a moment. This is the kind of danger that feels ancient, not because it's dramatic, but because it's timeless. Predators have been using patience as a weapon for hundreds of millions of years. Long before humans existed, long before the first stone tools, long before the first campfires, there were animals that learned how to disappear, how to blend, how to let time pass until the right second. Prehistoric Australia, with its mix of open spaces and wooded edges, with its shifting climates and changing habitats, would have rewarded those predators again and again. It would have produced hunters that fit into silence the way a key fits into a lock. And in that sense, the most unsettling part isn't imagining the attack. The most unsettling part is imagining how often the waiting worked, without anyone ever noticing it had been there. Because most of the time, the landscape looks calm. Most of the time, you see nothing. Most of the time, the prey animals move on without incident, and the predator remains unseen, choosing not to strike, conserving energy, letting the world continue. And that, strangely, can be soothing to think about as you settle deeper into rest, because it reminds you that even in the most dangerous ecosystems, violence is not constant. It is rare, it is selective, it is surrounded by long stretches of ordinary life, grazing, resting, traveling, breathing. So as you relax, imagine that ancient land again, not as a horror story, but as a living system, full of calm and tension, sunlight and shade, quiet movement and sudden possibility. A place where the shadows in the trees were not empty, a place where stillness could mean safety, or something watching, patient, and perfectly adapted to the silence. If mammals gave prehistoric Australia its heavy footsteps and shadowy intelligence, reptiles gave it something older, something that feels almost outside of time. Reptiles don't rush. They don't waste energy the way warm-blooded animals sometimes do. They can wait through heat and stillness, letting the sun do the work, letting patience become a kind of power. And Australia, across long stretches of prehistory, was a place where that kind of power could thrive. Picture the landscape under a high, bright sky. The sun isn't just light, it's pressure. It presses warmth into stone, into sand, into the thick skin of trees. The air shimmers slightly above the ground, and in that shimmering, the world becomes difficult to read. Shapes blur, distance becomes uncertain. Even sound seems to thin out, as if heat is absorbing it. This is a perfect stage for animals that don't need speed to be dangerous. Somewhere near a rocky rise, where shadows pool beneath ledges and scrub grows in tight clusters, there's a presence that doesn't move the way a mammal moves. It doesn't fidget. It doesn't shift weight impatiently. It simply occupies space, like part of the land itself. This is where the idea of a giant monitor lizard begins to feel real. In Australia's past, there lived a massive goanna-like predator, often referred to as Megalania, more formally known as Varanus priscus. Even the name monitor lizard can feel misleading here, because it makes you think of something familiar and manageable. But when you scale that body up, when you imagine a creature with the same alert eyes, the same confident stance, the same quiet readiness, suddenly the landscape changes around it. A large monitor doesn't need to roar. It doesn't need to charge in a straight line like a movie monster. What it needs is awareness and opportunity. Modern monitors are intelligent in their own way, capable of tracking, of remembering, of investigating. They read scent with flicking tongues. They follow trails. They circle. They test boundaries. They don't always attack immediately. They assess. Now imagine that same behavior in a larger body, in a world full of big prey and slower moving giants. The danger becomes less about sudden sprinting and more about inevitability. The feeling that if you are vulnerable and you are noticed, you may be followed. Patiently, quietly, without drama, until you make a mistake. And the most unsettling part is that you might not notice you're being followed at all. Not at first. Because reptiles, especially those built for hunting, can blend into stillness so completely that your eyes slide right over them. A shape that looks like a log is a log, until it isn't. A shadow that looks like a shadow remains a shadow, until it shifts with intention. In the heat of midday, when animals seek shade and movement slows, the reptile kingdom becomes more present, not less. That's when a predator can position itself near a path to water, near the edge of a clearing, near the narrow passage where a herd naturally funnels through. It doesn't need to chase the entire herd. It only needs one moment, a separated individual, a young one too curious, an exhausted animal that lingers too long. And then there are the crocodilians, creatures that make the idea of patience feel almost sacred. When we think of Australian crocodiles today, we picture river ambushes and sudden lunges from water. But the deeper past suggests a broader variety of crocodile relatives, some of them built differently than the modern image suggests. Across ancient Australia, there were crocodilians that may have inhabited different environments, with different skull shapes and hunting strategies. Some perhaps more suited to rivers, others possibly more comfortable on land or along mixed wetland edges. Even without knowing every detail, you can feel the implication. The crocodile role was not a single fixed thing. It was a family of approaches to survival, tuned to different places. Imagine an ancient billabong, a quiet, dark pool, where the water is still enough to reflect the sky like a dull mirror. The edges are muddy, crisscrossed with tracks. The air smells of damp earth and rotting leaves. Birds approach carefully. Herbivores come at dawn, stepping slow, testing the ground before they put full weight down. And beneath that still surface is a shape that doesn't breathe the way mammals breathe. A shape that can remain almost completely hidden, with only eyes and nostrils breaking the surface. A creature that feels as if it belongs to the water, the way stone belongs to the earth. The danger here isn't noise, it's the moment of certainty, when the water erupts and something enormous claims the edge. In a world of megafauna, even crocodilians would have faced challenges. Large prey can fight, large prey can pull away, large prey can injure. But crocodiles are built for committing to a moment. Their power is not only in the bite, but in the decision. Once they go completely. And around these waters, even the landscape itself feels like it participates. Mud can trap, slopes can slip, vegetation can block escape routes. The world doesn't need to help the predator consciously. It simply has physical properties that become part of the hunt. Then quietly, there are the snakes, an older kind of fear, or perhaps an older kind of awe. Australia today is famous for venomous snakes, for quick strikes and potent chemistry. But in parts of the prehistoric past, there were also enormous constrictors, snakes that did not rely on venom, but on pressure. One of the names that echoes from that time is Wanambi, a large snake whose body would have been thick and heavy, built for ambush and squeezing rather than speed. A large constrictor changes the mood of a landscape because it doesn't need to chase. It needs to be in the right place. It waits where animals pass close. It waits near burrows. It waits near water. It waits in the places where an animal's world becomes narrow, where there is less room to turn, less room to run, less room to understand what is happening until it is already wrapped. And constriction is a quiet kind of violence. There is no roar, no dramatic flailing across a wide space. It is intimate, close, controlled. It is the taking of breath, the closing of a life with patient certainty. It is the kind of predation that feels almost like the land itself tightening. If you imagine that ancient Australia as a web of pathways, tracks to water, routes between feeding grounds, corridors along tree lines, then reptiles are the knots in the web. Not everywhere, not constantly visible, but present enough to shape behavior, to make animals pause, to make them drink faster, to make them choose open routes, to make them move in groups when they can. And still, for all of this danger, the world would not have felt like chaos. It would have felt like balance, tense at times, calm at others. Most days, most hours, nothing dramatic happens. A predator fails more often than it succeeds. A prey animal survives far more days than it doesn't. The land continues. The wind continues. The sun rises and falls with indifferent gentleness. That's how ecosystems truly feel from the inside. Not like constant crisis, but like long stretches of ordinary living with sharp possibilities at the edges. And yet over time, something began to change. Not suddenly, Rarely anything in deep time is sudden, but gradually, like a slow dimming. The giants began to thin from the landscape. The megafauna that once pressed their stories into the mud became less common, then absent. The enormous herbivores that shaped vegetation and pathways became memories in the form of bones. The great predators, those adapted to big prey and wide territories, faced a world that no longer offered the same opportunities. And the quiet question that rises from this fading is one of the most haunting in Australia's natural history. What happened to the giants? If you step into that question gently, you find that there isn't a single, simple answer. Instead, there are overlapping forces, pressures that may have stacked together until a once stable world tipped into a new form. One force is climate. Australia is a continent shaped by dryness, and over long periods the climate has swung between wetter and drier phases. During colder glacial periods, rainfall patterns shift, vegetation changes, water becomes less predictable in some regions, lakes shrink, then disappear, grasslands expand in some places, woodlands retreat in others. Even when there is still plenty of life, the distribution of life becomes patchier, more dependent on refuges, on reliable waterholes, on narrow zones where food persists. For large animals, patchiness can be dangerous. A big body needs a lot of intake. A giant can endure short hardship, but when hardship becomes chronic, when good seasons are fewer, when droughts last longer, when the best feeding grounds shrink, then every year becomes a test. Reproduction slows, young survival drops, adults become thinner, and a population that once seemed unstoppable can become fragile, not from one catastrophe, but from a sustained narrowing of what is possible. The second force often discussed is the arrival of people. Humans are not just another predator, they are something different, flexible, strategic, able to cooperate, able to use tools, able to carry fire, able to reshape landscapes through repeated behavior. Even in small numbers, people can exert outsized influence because they don't hunt only as individuals, they hunt as planners. And they don't interact with the land only by walking through it. They can alter the land itself. In Australia, the timing and details of human arrival and megafauna decline have been debated and studied from many angles, and the picture is complex. But the general idea many researchers consider is that, as people spread through the continent, new pressures were added to ecosystems already adjusting to climate variability. Imagine what it would mean for a megafauna population that evolved without human hunters. Even if other predators existed, humans hunt differently. They can target adults. They can choose specific animals. They can hunt at a distance. They can return to the same water source again and again because they remember it and share it. And importantly, they can use fire, not just accidentally, but intentionally. Fire is a quiet but enormous factor in Australian landscapes. A single fire changes the ground quickly, but repeated burning over years can shift entire vegetation patterns. It can encourage grasses in some regions, reduce thick scrub in others, alter the density of woodland, and change the availability of certain plants. For some animals, these changes can be beneficial. For others, they can remove crucial shelter or reduce the types of food they rely on. And once vegetation shifts, everything shifts with it. Herbivores follow plants, predators follow herbivores, water usage changes, soil changes, erosion changes. The land becomes slowly a different place. Now, none of this requires a dramatic scene of everything dying at once. Extinction in the real world often looks like a long unraveling. The disappearance of a species isn't usually witnessed as a single event. Instead, it happens like this: fewer sightings, smaller herds, longer gaps between tracks, a region where an animal used to be common, now strangely empty, a breeding season with fewer young, a drought that hits harder than expected, a fire that removes a key refuge, a hunted group that doesn't recover because their reproduction is slow. And that slow unraveling is especially hard on large animals because large animals tend to reproduce slowly. They often have fewer young. They often invest more in each offspring. Their populations don't bounce back quickly after losses. So even a modest increase in adult mortality, whether from hunting, from drought stress, from habitat shifts, can push a population downward over time. As the megafauna thinned, the entire ecosystem would have changed texture. The big herbivores that once trampled paths and opened clearings were no longer there to do that work. Plants that were once kept in check could become denser in some places, while, in other places, grasses could spread. The movement of nutrients shifted, seed dispersal changed, the very shape of the landscape, how open it felt, how connected it felt, would have begun to alter, and predators that relied on large prey would have been affected too. A top predator is only as stable as the prey base beneath it. When big prey disappears, a predator may adapt to smaller prey if it can. But not all predators can shift easily. Some are built for a particular kind of hunt, a particular size range, a particular strategy. Without the right prey, their world becomes a narrower corridor, and eventually the corridor ends. Even reptiles, those patient masters of waiting, would have felt the change if the flow of large bodies across the land became smaller and less frequent. A big ambush hunter can wait for a large meal, but if large meals stop coming, waiting turns from strategy into starvation. What remains after the giants fade is not a safe Australia. It is simply a different Australia. The dangers become more concentrated in certain adaptations. Venom rather than size, camouflage rather than mass, speed rather than sheer strength. The ecosystem becomes a world of specialists, of quick lives and quick deaths, rather than slow giants that carry whole habitats in their footsteps. And there is something strangely gentle about that shift, even as it is tragic. Because the disappearance of megafauna doesn't feel like a scream across time. It feels like a quiet room after someone has left. The space is still there. The light is still there. The wind still moves across grass. But the scale feels reduced, as if the continent itself is remembering a larger version of its own body. If you let your mind rest on that image, it can become calming rather than frightening. The idea that the Earth is always changing, always reshaping, always turning one world into another. Australia did not become less alive when the giants vanished. It became different. It continued to evolve into the continent we know, still wild, still full of sharp edges, still capable of producing animals that are astonishing in their adaptations. And perhaps that's the most honest way to think about prehistoric danger here. It wasn't a story about monsters. It was a story about a continent learning what it could be, trying out extremes, then shifting again when the rules changed, when climate tightened its grip, when new arrivals altered the balance, when the great engines of megafauna no longer moved across the land. So as you relax deeper, imagine the last days of that ancient age not as a catastrophe, but as a slow sunset. A dry wind over open plains, a waterhole shrinking at the edges, tracks fading into dust. The land still beautiful, still vast, still indifferent and eternal. And somewhere, in the quiet of deep time, the echo of heavy footsteps lingers, not as a threat, but as a memory of scale, fading gently into the night, while you, here and safe, drift towards sleep.